Now let's come to day 3, which talks about Psalms chapter 7 and Psalms chapter 10. Now in question 6 it says, which attributes of God stand out to you from these two Psalms, 7 and 10? Why? Okay, so the first issue is identifying what are the attributes of God. So from chapter 7, there are 3 attributes. The first attribute is that God is regarded as a refuge. Verse 1, God is defined as just in verse 8. And God is also known as righteous. That's in verse 9 and 17. In fact, there are 2 additional subpoints to this. We see God's righteous wrath. That's in verse 6 and 11. And we see God as a righteous judge. That's in verse 11 as well. The attributes in chapter 10, there are 4 of them. The first one is a bit confusing. The psalmist describes God as distant. A bit strange, but let's hold the thought there. Discuss it with your leaders if you feel that there's a need to. So in verse 12 and 18, God is also regarded as a defender of the weak. In verse 14 and 17, a listener and a comforter. And in verse 16, God is described as a king. Now, the next issue is, why do they stand out to you? Now, again, a personal question. Please have a go at it. Okay, question 7. What do these psalms reveal about those who perpetuate wickedness and those who are afflicted? Okay, so there are a few issues here. Let's break it down. The first issue is, what do these psalms reveal about those who perpetuate wickedness? Now, the first thing to note is that evil will eventually come to an end. That is for certain. In chapter 7 verse 9 it says that there will be an end to the violence of the wicked, and the righteous will be made secure. How is this evil going to come to an end? God is going to attack evil. That's in verse 13. If he does not relent, he will sharpen his sword. He will bend his string and his bow. He will prepare deadly weapons, flaming arrows. These are weapons that God will use to attack evil. And in verse 16, God says that he will repay trouble with trouble. The trouble that evildoers cause will turn back on them, will bounce back towards them, and the violence that they commit will come crashing down on their own heads. Verse 16. And finally, those who perpetuate wickedness will be called to account. That's in chapter 10 verse 15. The evildoer will be called to account for his wickedness that will not otherwise be found out. Okay, so that's the first issue. The Psalms reveal about those who perpetuate wickedness, that evil will eventually come to an end by God's attack, and that trouble will be given back to them. Plus, there will be a need to account for all the wickedness that they have committed. Okay, so that is the first issue. The second issue is, what do the Psalms reveal about those who are afflicted? The first thing to remember is that God remembers the afflicted. In chapter 10 verse 12 it says, Arise, Lord, lift up your hand, O God. Do not forget the helpless. God does not forget those who are afflicted. God remembers those who are oppressed. God also sees and considers the troubles that the afflicted are going through. In verse 14 it says, You, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief. Not just consider it, you take it in hand, such that the victims can commit themselves to God. Third, God also encourages the afflicted. In verse 17 it says, You, God, hear the desires of the afflicted. You encourage them. Listen to their cry. God encourages those who are afflicted. And finally, God defends those who are oppressed and afflicted. In verse 18 it says, God defends the fatherless, the oppressed, such that mere mortals will never strike terror again. Okay, now let's move on to question 8. Who and what is David's constant hope? Who and what is your hope? So there are a few issues here. The first issue is, who and what is David's constant hope? In chapter 7, we see that there are 2 descriptions of hope. Hope is described as a refuge in verse 1 and as a shield in verse 10. Now in chapter 10 verse 14, we see hope described as a vindication. So there are 3 kinds of hope that are being espoused in the 2 Psalms here. Hope as a refuge, a shield, and the hope that vindication will eventually come. Now, the next issue is, who and what is your hope? Is it your friends? Is it the paycheck that's going to come by? Is it our own intellect? Have a go at it. It's a personal question.